Welcome back to the Photo Banter podcast. I'm your host, Alex Gagne, and on today's podcast, I speak with photographer David Hume Kennerly. David Hume Kennerly is a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer for his images documenting the Vietnam and Cambodia wars, refugees escaping East Pakistan to India, and his famous photos of the Ali vs. Frazier fight titled The Fight of the Century that took place at Madison Square Garden. David worked as the official White House photographer for President Gerald R. where he had unrestricted access to the president on a daily basis. In this interview, I speak to David about his early days working for newspapers in the Pacific Northwest, his friendship with photographer Ansel Adams, who he photographed for the cover of Time magazine, and I also speak to David about his approach to covering U.S. politics for nearly 50 years for some of the top publications in the business. David is someone who has documented some of the most important moments in world history, so I was really excited to get a chance to speak with him about his amazing career. I hope you enjoy, and thanks so much for listening. All right, well, David Hume Kennerly, welcome to the podcast. Really excited to talk to you. Been following your work for years, big fan. And as we speak right now, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is lying in state. Who I know you've had some experience photographing. So I was just kind of curious, maybe you could talk a little bit about your experience photographing her, because I think you photographed her a couple times.
Well, yeah, quite a few times, but once in our chambers where, there you go. This was in 2002, I believe. Yep, says it right in the caption. Hey, nothing like my Instagram feed, right? David Hume Kennerly, all one word. She was great. She was kind of used to having publicity, and she wasn't too nervous. But what I liked about this photograph was she was such a diminutive person, and so there she is in that big office, and her feet are barely on the ground. Kind of reminded me of photographing Deng Xiaoping a little bit in 1975. And Deng Xiaoping and she probably would see eye to eye. I don't know how big Ruth was or how tall, but Deng Xiaoping was like around 5 something, stretching it. But yeah, this is the same session. I put up some contact sheets. But I get along well with people. I think it's one of the secrets of the business. My dad was a traveling salesman. And I used to go around with him, watching him sell stuff to people that they either weren't sure they wanted or didn't want, but they ended up buying it anyway. And I really learned how to engage with people. And I think that's an important thing for photographers.
Because what did you photograph Ruth
I'm a good photographer, but I'm not. I mean, there are a lot of better ones, but you've got to get in the room with your subjects.
Yeah, for sure. Because what did you photograph? What were these photos used for? And had you photographed any Supreme Court justices prior to this? Because like Supreme Court justices, there's such a lot of times you don't hear a ton about these people. So I would imagine it was a pretty interesting experience getting the opportunity to go into one of their chambers.
Yeah, I've actually been in there quite a few times. I got to know Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman to go on the U.S. Supreme Court. But I'd photographed over the years several justices, Chief Justice Rehnquist in his chamber. And, again, these are people to me. I don't look at anyone as a title, but as a human being.
Yeah.
And sometimes you get a little intimidated, but where I get most anxious is when I don't think I'm going to get a photo or an appointment with somebody that I want to get photographs of. But most people are easy to deal with, particularly politicians, because they understand the game. And it's one reason I've always preferred doing that to like movie stars who are, they depend on how they look and all that. I totally get it. I mean, I'm not even critical. It's just that politicians are more interesting to me. I mean, they're not reading somebody else's lines. They're making up their own book. in their own play and their own screenplay. And so, and they're the ones making the world go around, the ones starting the wars and ending them.
Yeah.
Excuse me. It's all about history for me. I've been in it from the get-go for the history, and I've had a good ride.
Yeah, I was reading before this interview. You on your website, when you pull it up, it's a whole little thing about John McCain. And one of the things I found interesting was how your experience photographing him. Like I think you said in the little blog excerpt on your site, you walked into his office and he was in the middle of like yelling at someone on the phone, but he still saw you and he's like, "Come on in," and he kind of just gave you that access. And
he was great. I mean, for one thing, I didn't just like waltz in there after having not known him to some degree. And I covered his 2000 campaign pretty much from start to finish. But he was a feisty, cantankerous guy. In my Vietnam period, I think, impressed him to the degree that I was been shot at, and of course he got shot down, and he was just like a real person. I liked him. I respected the hell out of him. I've never been particularly political. Even though I worked for a Republican president. In fact, I've been working for President Ford for maybe 2 or 3 months, and we were waiting for somebody to come in the Oval Office, and he said, "I've never asked you, are you a Republican or a Democrat?" Then he said, "Don't answer that." I mean, he didn't know, he didn't care, that which is really that's where I live. But McCain was a unique guy and very approachable. He liked people. He loved the press. I mean, he got beaten up a little bit, but on his 2000 campaign, the press people would sit in the back of the bus with him, and it was like a nonstop press conference for him. He would talk to anybody, anytime. And President Ford was kind of like that. I mean, not as much access just from the fact when he was president, of course, but he wasn't afraid of the press. Didn't like what they wrote about him a lot, but that wasn't an issue for him. He understood the First Amendment and what their job was, and he wasn't afraid to get tough questions. And when you look at what's going on today, it's just a nonstop attack on the press, the First Amendment, and it's disturbing to me and upsetting, really.
Yeah, it's crazy. And like you said, politics wasn't always like your thing, but like when you kind of started photography, what was kind of your first interest? Because I think looking at everything you've accomplished with everything, all the politics you cover, obviously that's not all you cover, but a lot of people know you from that stuff. But I guess from the early days, like how did you kind of get into photography, and what was kind of your interest early on?
Well, early on, I had interests were girls and getting out of class, and so being a photographer kind of like fit all of that, like the cheerleaders, taking pictures of them, and then they'd want to have prints later, so that it established a relationship. And but as a kid, I was excited about news and what was going on, and recently there was an anniversary of 1959. There was a warehouse. I'm from a little lumber town in Oregon, Roseburg, Oregon. And there was a fire, and this guy had parked his dynamite truck next to it. And it had ammonium nitrate and dynamite, and it blew up. And the Beirut thing was certainly way bigger, but it brought that whole thing to mind. But I was 12 years old, and we were only about 5 blocks from the building supply place. Kind of our house was sort of up on a hill, and it was like 1:30 in the morning, and these big fire sirens go off because it calls in the volunteer firemen. And I could see the place burning, and I had these French windows, thank God, because they were open. It was a hot night, and all of a sudden there was this gigantic explosion. It looked like a nuclear bomb. It was so huge. It was like tons of dynamite and ammonium nitrate, and it blew me all the way across the room.
Holy
and,
cow.
I went back to watch. It blew out every window in our house. It ended up killed like 15 people. The crater was like 50 feet across. It blew up the junior high school I was going to be starting that fall, but I wasn't really taking pictures then. But I remember seeing in a much less dramatic fashion a Roseburg News Review photographer coming by, and it was some garage fire in our neighborhood, and the fireman came, and this guy walked through the police lines, and it really stuck with me. And I thought, I'd like to do that. I don't have to fight the fire, but I could like take pictures of all this stuff.
Yeah, up in the action.
And I think my last 2 years in high school were at a place up near Portland, a place called West Lynn. And I convinced them that I should work on the newspaper and the annual. I convinced them I had a lot more experience than I did, even though I was a junior in high school. But that really got me into it. So I photographed like everything from cheerleaders, certainly, but the football players, basketball, just things going on in the high school. My first published photo was in 1962 in a high school newspaper in Roseburg, and I still have it.
Oh, wow.
And so I've been doing it really since I was like 15 years old, I guess. I've kind of stacked that up. But I've always had a clear direction about history. And my interest in politics came from Robert Kennedy coming to Portland, Oregon in '66. It was before he was running for president, but we of my age all remember where we were when we heard that John F. Kennedy was killed, and it was such a shock. And so here's his brother. I guess it was like 3 years later. I was a young staff photographer for the Oregon Journal, and he came to speak at a labor hall campaigning for Edith Green, who was one of the few women in Congress, actually. And I'll never forget it because it also informed how I treat other people throughout the course of my career. But this room was packed. I couldn't get into the room, and I saw a photographer standing on the periphery, and I knew he wasn't from Portland. It looked like he was traveling with Kennedy. I went over and I said, "Hey, you look like you know what you're doing." I said, "How do you get through these crowds?" And he said, "Hang on to my coat, kid." And he just like sliced through the crowd. And not only that, but he said, "Here, stand up on this place and look at this angle, and you'll get a great shot with the crowd and the senator and all that." And the photographer was Bill Epridge of Life Magazine.
Wow.
And Bill, that was remarkable because he didn't have to do that. But you can see how panicked I was. And but more important, what happened later that night was following Kennedy and his little ragtag motorcade out to the airport. And it was like the DC-3 with his motors turning on the tarmac, and Kennedy runs up the stairs and waves, and then Epridge went up right after him and goes into the plane. The door closes, it taxis out into the night. It was like that final scene of Casablanca, where Rick is on the runway watching his love take off, and it was at that moment, and I'm not kidding, that I wanted to be on that airplane, and I've never had. It was a profound feeling that I had that I wanted to be with the circus. I wanted to see where Robert Kennedy was going, or other people like him, and I endeavored to do that. And that was the big jolt for me.
Was like a lot of people growing up in their town, a lot of people want to get out of wherever they grew up. Was that kind of the same thing for you? Like, were you kind of itching to get out of Oregon? Or because a lot of photographers feel like they got to live in DC or New York or whatever these bigger cities are at?
I think, that's a really good question, but I think getting out of Roseburg was something I'd really thought about, but there's nothing I could do. I was a kid, but my dad, my parents I think it was middle of my junior year, which was kind of a peculiar time to leave the place you grew up all those years.
Mm-hmm.
But he got a job up outside Portland in West Lynn, and he told the family, and I had 3 younger sisters, and they were just beside themselves, like, what? We're going to leave? And I mean, I was like in the car a day ahead of time waiting to go. I was like, I swear to God, I couldn't wait to get out of there. It was like I felt so confined because I knew that, for instance, like there were no black people in Roseburg. Black people were like a rumor. That part of Oregon is very conservative, and Oregon, which I found out later on, used to be kind of like a whites only state. It was very bizarre, and particularly that part. So there was no
diversity.
No diversity. Like some Jewish friends and Catholics, that was about it. And so, but moved up to West Lynn, and but Portland is a vibrant place, and to me, that was the big city. That was like going to Oz, really. I mean, I had my travel experience was very limited, and so that was a big deal. And I remember in '62 going up to Seattle for the Seattle World's Fair because my dad had a booth there. He was selling some stuff, and that was fantastic. And it's almost like one of those like Jurassic Park, where like who's the star of that? But the only way you ever remember her is like every time she sees the dinosaur, it's always like, that's the shot. Like her mouth is open. It's really stupid. But anyway, I was taken with that, and so my dreams were big. They were big. There's no question about it. And getting out of Portland wasn't as compelling as getting out of Roseburg had been.
Yeah, because I know you ended up going to work for the Oregonian, amazing newspaper, and some of your, I don't know, pretty early on shots, you photographed like Miles Davis, Igor Stravinsky, I think the Rolling Stones, and I believe that was all when you're kind of at the Oregonian newspaper.
Well, actually, it was the Oregon Journal.
Got it.
Well, and I was 19. So, I mean, I always get asked about college, and so I went to Portland State, then college, for about a half hour because I got a job on the Oregon Journal as a fill-in for one of the guys that was going off to 6 months active duty in the military. And this was 1966, and it was very clear that job was only going to be until he came back.
Yeah.
And so he came back, and I photographed all those people. You mentioned Mick Jagger when he was 23 years old. That was their first tour of America. But I got called into the publisher's office, and I just figured, I mean, the publisher was like a godlike figure that you never saw. I mean, he was off in some corner office, and he wanted to see me. And I just figured he's going to say, nice having you here, and adios. And he had this stack of newspapers with pictures in it that I'd taken, and he looked through them. He said, "Hey, kid, you did a pretty good job." And he showed one that particularly got him was like a deer that was still alive that had been burned in a forest fire, and it had been used. It was on the front page. It made a huge reaction, and it was then used for a fire prevention kind of campaign by the Park Service, and he said, "Well, you've done such a good job. I want to offer you a full-time position." And I was like, "Oh my God! I mean, this is like unbelievable." And by the way, it's the last time that was the last time I ever applied for a job. I mean, because I was approached for almost everything else I did, but the guy's name was Bill Knight. He was Phil Knight's dad.
Oh wow!
And I had the opportunity to tell Phil Knight this story like 2 years ago. And Phil said, wow, he said, my dad never did that for me. He said, in fact, I asked him if I get a job on the Oregon Journal, and he wouldn't do it. He said, I can't hire my kid here. And so I went and got a job on the Oregonian.
Yeah.
And I was a sports writer and all that. And so it was pretty amusing. But and as I told him when he said his dad wouldn't hire him, I said, "Yeah, it really screwed up your career." So anyway, I then went in the military for 6 months active duty, came out, and that's when I got the Oregonian job. And shortly thereafter, I was offered a job to work at UPI in Los Angeles.
When you go from the Oregon Journal to the Oregonian, was there a big difference in this, how the newspaper operated? Like, what do you kind of remember about working at a newspaper back then? Was there like a lot of photographers? Was it kind of like a competitive environment? Like, what do you kind of remember about that?
Well, did you ever see the play, The Front Page, in the movie?
No, I can't
You
say
got to
I
look
have.
at it. It's one of the great all-time newspaper movies, The Front Page, and I think Cary Grant's in that one. I can't remember, but it's great, and it's about newspaper in the old style. So the Oregonian and the Oregon Journal were both in the same building, and no, there wasn't much difference. The Oregonian was bigger. The Journal was an afternoon newspaper, but they had the big newsroom, and I really kicked myself in retrospect for not doing more photos of that, because it was really the last of the good old days. The bullpen, the editors, the guys with the green visors, people yelling at each other, and getting, and these crusty old photographers. I was like the youngest guy by far, and anytime there would be some, like a shootout or something, oh, let's send Kennerly.
Oh, yeah, I don't
So
want to
yeah, sure, I'll take it.
Yeah, because like how many photographers were on staff like when you were at the Oregonian, and what was kind of like how did it
Well, the
kind of work?
Oregonian probably had, I can't remember. It had to be a dozen to 15.
So yeah, a good amount of photographers.
There were a lot, yeah, and but a couple of them were like my heroes. I mean, they like David Falconer was one, and then Pete Corvallis was another one, and but these are guys that I had looked up to, because I wasn't seen. I must say, I didn't. A lot of people say, well, it was Life and Look magazine, but really for me, it was the local newspaper photographers. That's where I was seeing most of the work. And occasionally I would see a Life and all that, but
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily aspire to that. I like, and when I got the UPI job and moved to Los Angeles, and I was 21, and that was great. I mean, I'm essentially a wire service photographer at heart. I mean, a wire service photographer is like a utility outfielder. I mean, you can play any position, and you'd have to cover all these different stories, and you'd have to get the stuff out like right then and there, a deadline every minute. And really, that business hasn't changed that much in terms of being competitive.
Yeah, because how does that work? Like, obviously, when you're a newspaper photographer, you're on staff and they're giving you assignments. And then, like you said, you went to UPI, wire service. Personally, I've never worked for a wire service, but like, how does that kind of work exactly when you're working for like UPI, I guess?
Well, the United Press International and AP were at that time the main competitors. AP was a member owned operation. It still is. I think whoever their clients are, they pay their share of whatever it is. UPI was a for-profit kind of a thing, but mainly it's like covering everything, big on sports. So I became a good sports photographer. Everything from car wrecks to plane crashes to politics to everything. I mean, newspapers are like that too, but you were doing more assignments. There were less photographers doing it, and I was covering the LA area. And
Okay.
so, but it was great experience for me. And it was then that I actually did get on the airplane. They sent me over to join the Robert Kennedy campaign in New Mexico. And I went up to the campaign people. I'm Dave Kennerly with UPI. I mean, I was 21, but I still looked like I was 18 years old. And I'm supposed to get on the plane and go with you over to Arizona. And they said, you're not going to get on the plane. And I said, what do you mean? He said, no. I mean, it's like, we don't believe you. You're like too young to be doing this. And so I got, for one thing, all of a sudden I got scared because I couldn't call back over and say I couldn't get on the airplane,
Yeah,
and
there's no. This is
so I kind
pre
of,
cell phones and
oh,
email
no,
and
no,
all
no,
that.
this is 1968.
I
My
know, I
God,
know. That's what people got
52
to
years
remember when
ago.
they're listening to
I
this.
can't believe. Anyway, so I just basically went ape shit, and I said, I'm with UPI and I'm supposed to be here and I've got this assignment. And the one guy says, okay, anybody talks like that's got to be in the news business, right?
Mhm.
so they let me on the plane, and it was this is thrilling, but I was like so panicked that I wasn't going to happen. And I'm sitting there. Robert Kennedy came on the plane after his stop, and he walked by, and he turned around because he hadn't seen me. He said, "Hi, Bob Kennedy," um, and he said, "Who are you?" And I told him, and he said, "Well, how's everything going?"
Wow.
And I said, "Well, not very well. Your staff wasn't going to let me on the plane." And so he goes, "Really?" I said, "Yeah. I mean, they thought I was like, too young or something." And he
Yeah.
said, "Well, don't worry about it." And
That's
so we got to the next stop, and all of a sudden, there are like two aides. Oh, Mr. Kennerly, is there anything we can do for you? He must have
oh
kicked
yeah.
their ass,
Can we
but
give you a drink?
it was cool. It was cool. I mean, I think the thing about this business, in a way, you have so many different skills you have to employ. You have to be a producer. You have to be a logistician to get at that time, your film back. You have to sell your way into a situation. You got to be a BS artist, certainly in that regard to some degree. And but it's the photography part of it. Really, it's just one element,
Yeah. Yeah.
and there's just all these other things, and I learned how to do it.
Yeah, because like, did you always have that confidence and like you said, like you had to like really push yourself to get onto that plane and like, have you always just kind of had that personality of like, because I would imagine like you're saying like as a photographer, you're just a hired gun and you got to make stuff happen, and it's just like dealing with personalities. Like, did you always kind of have that confidence growing up, or you feel like it's something you kind of got better at over
I
time?
know. I think. I mean, I don't want to get into some big shrink session here, but but I still, as a kid, I think I was kind of insecure, and I think photography actually, because I got into it at an early age, knowing this is what I wanted to do, that I think that really helped me out, and just knowing and I learned from all these other photographers, like the ethics of the business and like all of that, and like the competitiveness of it. And in a way, it's kind of like being a professional athlete, because you're up against really good photographers all the time, and you'll be out on the same job. And if you get outshot all the time, you're not going to have a job, And so I figured that out. But it's funny. That was a good question, because flash forward just recently, the last couple of years, I did a workshop helping like wounded Marines out down at Camp Pendleton, and it's Harrison Ford's brother, Terrence, has been running this program, like a workshop with photography, and his contention for these wounded people, disabled or having PTSD and all the
Hmm.
attendant trouble they get. But it was clear to me that photography really helped a lot of these people out. It allowed them to express themselves in a way that they couldn't do it even talking or maybe writing or whatever. And I think I was kind of like, certainly not having gone through that trauma. I mean, I did go through that kind of trauma, but I didn't fortunately have that kind of, wasn't affected badly by it. But it was clear that this really did help them out. And because that caused me to think about my upbringing and everything else. And I really related to that. And but I've always had a lot of confidence, and you can't be like a retiring figure in my end of the business. I mean, there are just tons of
Yeah.
different, you talk to photographers in all sorts of fields, and
Yeah.
we're all different, but the mission is pretty much the same. Whatever you're trying to do as a news guy, wire guy, was a little more strenuous on the day-to-day requirements of photographing news, because it could be dangerous or it could be like anxiety producing or whatever.
Yeah, definitely in high stress situations. And like, what do you remember about, because we talked about when we talked the other day a little bit about how nowadays, like if you're covering a campaign or politics, they kind of just got all the press pool like in one little marked off spot. But like, what do you remember about like those days back then, like when you're shooting Robert F. Kennedy and stuff like that? Like, was there as much red tape, or were photographers and media more free to kind of like just approach people and kind of do their thing? Like, what's kind of the biggest difference now?
Yeah, that's well, I mean, the closer you get to the candidacy of either party, the more restrictive it becomes. All of a sudden there's the plane, there's the all this and that. But even to this day, I mean, one of the reasons I like covering the New Hampshire primaries is because everybody's still out there on their own. They're more accessible. I mean, in a way, that process has never changed that much. And they're all, because it's early, there's no certain candidate. Mm-hmm. And unless they were already a federal protectee, like a VP, like Gore was at the time or something like that, then it's a more formal situation because you have the Secret Service to deal with, and which has always been fine. I mean, the service I've always gotten along with pretty well. Mm-hmm. Whoops, did I hit something?
Oh, you're good.
I almost like eradicated our talk here.
No, you're
good. But no, it was pretty freeform. And of course, Robert Kennedy was assassinated because he only had the one bodyguard with him. So when he went into the kitchen at the Ambassador Hotel, the guy with the gun was there. There was nothing to prevent it. And mm-hmm. even these days, I mean, that could happen early on in a situation. In a way, that was, I guess, because his brother was shot and everything. I mean, you could second guess that all day long, but generally it's pretty easy going until somebody gets closer in. With John McCain in his campaign, where I was on the bus with him, I mean, everything was sitting on his lap. I mean, he just allowed access. Now, a lot of people don't. They want to have their staff keep you at a distance. And the Bernie Sanders guys were kind of jerks about it, actually, as I recall.
Yeah.
And, he's a cantankerous guy, too, but not in a good way. But, mm-hmm. But now, I mean, what's happened now because of the virus and all that is the campaign came to basically a dead stop after New Hampshire in February, when I was there. And I had good pictures of Biden, and it was a Trump rally I did, and hearing the same bullshit from him about, the fake news and the media and waving his finger and keeping you back in the press area where you were referring to that. Mm-hmm. But they're just, everything is clamped down because of the virus. And so everything is like pools for this and that. And I understand it, but unless you're working for the New York Times or AP or Reuters or, a wire service, it's pretty hard to cover.
Yeah. And it's hard to make a good photograph if you can't be there. And when you're working at UPI, because I think you started working in Los Angeles, but eventually I think I read you ended up going to Washington. When you kind of went to Washington, what kind of stuff was this straight politics at that point? Because I know eventually you ended up working for Gerald Ford. How did that kind of?
Well, that was kind of a circuitous route. You would call him a mentor these days. We didn't think that way back then, but Dirk Halstead was the head UPI photographer, and I worked with him in LA when he came out to cover Nixon after the convention in '68. And he recommended to the big shots in New York that they bring me back there. That was the world headquarters for UPI. It was in the in the Daily News building, and I loved being in New York. And that was '69, so it was the year of the Mets.
Oh yeah, the Miracle Mets.
The Miracle Mets, and it was like I covered all the series games there at Shea Stadium, where they won. Tom Seaver was a winning pitcher, and who recently died.
Yep.
And so they were. I mean, at that point, I was like 23 years old, and so they asked me to move to Washington. They liked what I was doing, and they thought they could shake things up a little bit in D.C. I mean, I don't know why they thought it needed it, but they're all good photographers down there. And so I went down and got put on the White House rotation, which is they had like 5 photographers. So every month it's your turn on the White House. So wherever the president of the United States goes, at that point it was Richard Nixon, you'd go with him. So I had my first ride on Air Force One when I was 23 years old. And yeah, that's exciting stuff. I mean, I didn't take it for granted. I don't take anything for granted. Even now, I mean, my attitude really hasn't changed that much. Somebody said I still have the mind of an 18-year-old. I don't know if that's a good thing.
that's
figure out, is he like dissing me or what?
That's why I mean, like we were talking the other day, and I was like, I really appreciate this. You can just looking at your Instagram, your website, and you still just have like an incredible enthusiasm for what you're doing, and you've been at it for a long time. So it's just like really inspiring to hear people that are like, I think you're in your 70s now, and you're still just like out there shooting assignments and getting after it.
Yeah, and I think I mean, there's no reason to stop, really. Mm-hmm. Somebody asked me what my hobby was, and I said it's photographing birds. I mean, I like to shoot bird pictures because it's hard.
Yeah,
and it's fun. I mean, the results are terrific. And by the way, I mean, I don't know if you talk about product at all, but Canon just came out with this R5 camera.
Yeah, I've read about it.
I have 2 of them. I just got it, and I kind of went to mirrorless when HBO was it was the final episode of Veep, and mm-hmm. Julia Louis-Dreyfus and David Mandel, was the producer, asked if I would photograph it for them because they had both been on Seinfeld. I did the final episode of Seinfeld.
Wow.
In '98 as a Newsweek assignment. It was fun. And but I hate using blimps, but they had just come out with the EOS R. Is that right? Yeah, and it has a silent function, and I think they were a little behind Sony and maybe Fuji and the mirrorless stuff because I hadn't tried them. But boy, they were great. Then the new ones came out. But the point is, they have these incredible lenses. There's the new one is a 100 to 500 millimeter lens. It's unbelievable. And then there's another one I bought, and it's a preset F11 800 millimeter.
Yeah.
And it's just like light. I mean, you could like.
Yeah, it is crazy. The camera's gotten a lot smaller. I haven't tried that camera out. I'm using the Canon 5D Mark IV. This is what's filming the video, and yeah, I love them. But it's like the new R system. You got to buy a whole new set of lenses because it's a whole different mount. That's the only problem with it.
Well, you could get an adapter.
Yeah, you can get. Yeah,
I mean, they have an adapter, but quite frankly, those lenses are so superior. There's a 50 1.2 lens. Oh my God. Mm-hmm. I mean, it just blows your mind. And I'm not like a techie person. I don't sit around and talk about like cameras that much, but these are my tools, all I want. I mean, as you well know from the film days, I started out with Nikon Fs and, it's a f-stop and a shutter speed. I mean, essentially that's it. And now you got it's like Star Trek. You open the back of the damn thing.
You can be like 5 stops under or over and bring it all back in. It's crazy. But I guess for what you do, a lot of situations when you're shooting politics or even other situations, having the silence thing, it can help you tremendously. Like especially like in those.
Not really. I really don't use it that much. I mean, but when I was the chief White House photographer, I used Leicas and some Nikons. I mean, I switched to Canon in 1995, and that's all I use now, and the iPhone, of course. But the Leica was quiet. I mean, in the Oval Office and everything, it was really better to use, and the quality was good and all that. So I had a couple Leicas, and then the longer lenses I'd still use the Nikon with it. In '95, I switched over to Canon film cameras, and then when digital got better, I made that transition.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I guess to go back, like we kind of touched on a little bit, like your first trip was with Nixon, kind of photographing him a little bit. What do you kind of remember about that guy? Because doing a little research, his photographer, I believe Ollie Atkins.
Ollie Atkins.
It didn't sound like Nixon was very nice to him as a photographer.
Well, I give talks frequently, and there's a clip I found in the Nixon library, and it was because I also produce documentaries and stuff like that, but I worked with the Naudet brothers, the French brothers who did the 9/11 video, won the Emmy for it. It was the most extraordinary film ever. Anyway, we did a documentary on White House chiefs of staff. It was a 4-hour Discovery Channel thing. So I went around to all the libraries, and even though I was a producer, that was something I wanted to do, and pulled out pictures of chiefs of staff, with LBJ, with all Yochi Okamoto was the first civilian White House photographer, and then Ollie. And I found this video clip of Nixon talking to Ollie, who wants to take a picture the night before he resigns as president, but it's like, I'm going to be on live TV, and he's going to announce that at noon tomorrow I'll be leaving,
Yeah, and he's like, it's only going to be. He's like, it's only going to be the network or whatever, the people from the channel.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable, and I still, every time I see it, I go, poor Ollie, man. I feel bad for this guy. And so it's Nixon saying, well, the press had their picture and you had yours and blah blah blah. And this is the guy that worked for him for like 6 years and during the campaign, and but just had very little access to Nixon, and so that was right before it went on live TV. So they have Nixon sitting behind the desk talking. That's what the video is. But the one thing I knew was I wasn't sure Ford was going to ask me to be his photographer. I suspected he was, but I didn't want to be in a situation where I was not going to have any access to the president. And the night, so Nixon leaves at noon on August 9th, 1974. And one of the Ford kids, and I'd gotten to know them all because I was covering Ford as vice president for Time magazine because of John Derniak. Now, that's something that would be very unlikely to happen these days. But I just got to know the family, the Fords, really well. And they said, Mom and Dad want you to come over to the house tonight. So they didn't move into the White House for 10 days. All the Nixon stuff was there. It was a quick but peaceful transition. But anyway, so the Fords lived in this little, I still remember the address. It was like 914. Oh no, I don't remember it. Sorry, I thought I did. Right. I've been over there. Oh, it's been 45 years, But Crown View Drive, there it is. And so it was a split level, not a fancy house. I mean, they never really had any money, and so there were a few friends and family there. It wasn't like a big celebration. It was kind of a serious day. The president resigns, the first time in history, and here's Ford and President Ford. And he said, one point during the evening, he said, well, I want you to stay after everybody else goes. I want to talk to you. And of course, I figure he's going to offer me the job. Yep. So we go into the living room and we sit down on the couch. and he's smoking his pipe. And, I'm like 27 years old. And no matter what, till the day I die, I'm still a kid from Roseburg, Oregon. I still grew up in a small town, no political influence. I mean, and I'm sitting there with the president of the United States, even though I knew the guy. And all I could think is like, why isn't Henry Kissinger here or something? I mean, this is totally bizarre for me. And
it's like, don't you have more important stuff to be doing?
but, it was clear he wanted me to work for him. And so he asked me the question. He said, how would you feel? I'm paraphrasing again, but it was essentially this. I mean, how would you feel about coming to work for me as my White House photographer? And I thought about it. And what the main thing I thought about was I didn't want to do it and become like another Ollie Atkins. So I looked him right in the eye and I said, I would love to, but only if I reported directly to you and I had total access to everything that was going on in the White House. Mm-hmm. And he stopped smoking his pipe. And I thought, well, there you go. And, I'm going to have to call my parents and say, well, the president offered me this job and I told him to shove it. And he started laughing and he said, you don't want Air Force One on the weekends? But the other thing that happened though was he said, look, I'll talk to Al because Ollie was a friend of his. He said, Ollie's a friend of mine. Mm-hmm. I don't want to just drop this on him. I want to talk to Al Haig, who was the chief of staff, and we'll work it out. And so later that evening, I don't tell this story much. So he wanted to watch the replay of the news. So it must have been around 10 o'clock because that's when the local news came on in Washington, D.C. He said, I didn't see my swearing in and all that today. Let's watch it on TV. I said, okay.
Wow. So you're just sitting in his, that's amazing. So he's the president of the United States. He's not living in the White House. He's just in his normal house.
You're over there on Crownview Drive in Alexandria.
And you're just sitting there with him watching the replay.
Yes. And you know what? It was not for me. That wasn't that unusual with them because I'd really gotten to know him pretty well. I mean, it was a good relationship. And I think Susan Ford was there and Mrs. Ford was there. And I think Steve Ford was. That's it. That's the only people in the house. And then the Secret Service, obviously, outside. But we went into the den and he turns the TV on. It's not working. And it's like, this house is not big. Yeah. And he goes, oh, we only got one. Let's go upstairs and watch it upstairs in their bedroom. So Mrs. Ford and Susan and me and Steve, and we watched him get sworn in. Like, I didn't even take pictures of it. It was just like, this is so
crazy,
personal, and
yeah.
But the what happened at the end of that? I said, well, look. I better be going. I mean, you got to get up in the morning and be president like the first time he goes.
Yeah.
And he took my hand with both of his. He said, let me ask you something. He said, well, if you come to work for me, will that be a bad thing with your friends or colleagues after everything that's happened with Nixon? And I was taken aback by that. I mean, the fact that he would even say something like that, which reflects very much who he is. But he said, I said, no. I said, you know the photographers. They all really like you. You know every one of them by name. They're going to be happy to have me in the White House because I'm an advocate for them. I want to help them. I'm sure they'll want to come in and take pictures, not in a big group. And I want to be there for them and do my job. And he goes, good. Well, I'll see you tomorrow and I'll let you know what happens with Al. Flash forward, I'm sitting in the Time magazine office the next day in the mailroom. And the operator, as well as deals with the intercom, the operator gets it. She's, David, call the operator. And I called her and she said, David, the president of the United States wants to talk to you. And I said, well, tell him to call back. I'm busy. And she goes, he's on the phone. He just called over. Is Dave Kennerly there? And so I got on with him, And he said, "Okay, we're all clear. Do you still want the job?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm happy to do it. I'd be." He said, "Well, you better get over here right now. You've already wasted half a day of the taxpayers' money." And so this office was like right across Lafayette Square from the White House. And I walked out the door, went into the White House, and started a new chapter of my life.
So it sounded like he had like a pretty good sense of humor. Like he was.
He did, yeah.
Yeah.
He also, by the way, I just had a very large exhibition at the Ford Library. CBS Sunday Morning did a piece on me a few weeks ago at the Ford Library. It was a giant show, and Jim Axelrod, the correspondent, said, "Well, what do you want people to get out of this show?" We were walking around and looking at it, and I said, "I want people to, when they come out of here, to know who President Ford was. That's really important to me." And I don't even make comparisons with him and the president guy. I mean, it's there's no comparison.
No.
Like Ford, and I mean, you could dump on this guy all day long, and I've done my fair share. But the fact is, Ford, in a genuine sense, was in World War II. He was went to Yale Law School. He was an incredibly smart guy. But first and foremost, he had a big heart. He didn't harbor racism. And because if you listen to some of the Nixon tapes, you hear him talking about certain people, and he just treated everybody the same. I mean, and that's not, I don't make this up. I mean, I was with that guy almost every day, 7 days a week for 2.5 years. I traveled to every country with him and went through ups and downs, and really kind of became part of the family, but with my professional edge, of course. And but I learned so much from him about how you can disagree without being disagreeable. He and Tip O'Neill, who was became Speaker of the House, but who was the majority leader in the House, would kick each other around during the week politically, and then play golf on the weekends. And they liked each other. It's not all the stuff that's going on now where people are just like, you're either there or you're here, and it's not the way it was.
Yeah. And do you feel like a part of the reason you got the access you did is it seemed like he wanted full transparency after everything that happened with Nixon? Do you feel like that was kind of part of the situation why he gave people gave you the access, I guess?
That it's a really good question, but it was never really framed that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people have written about that and said that was part of it.
Yeah.
The thing, President Ford was a really shrewd guy, although he didn't play one on TV. I mean, he was tough when he had to be tough, and he was politically really sharp. And of course, having been in the minority party almost his whole career from 1948,
mm-hmm.
From 1948 when he went into the House and then became president, but VP then president. I mean, he knew how to play politics, but he played it with a soft glove, not a cudgel.
Yeah.
And so whether he felt that this was something about having me there and putting pictures out and all that, it may have crossed his mind, but I don't think it was the reason. The real reason was that we got along.
Yeah.
He liked me. He liked my irreverent sense of humor. He knew I wasn't looking to get another job, that I wasn't like trying to cut people down. I mean, I was really being a White House photographer, if you do it right, is like a tiring, difficult job. I mean, you're in there for everything, but it was a personal relationship, and I didn't hold back on difficult photos. The day he lost, other times that were tough.
Yeah.
But I think he liked my honesty. He appreciated my Vietnam background.
Yeah.
I was a combat veteran in the sense of being in the
mm-hmm.
the press corps.
Yeah.
And he thought it was funny, and there were a lot of times where, man, he was down, and I would say, something that might lighten it up. And, I was called like the court jester sometimes, but I wasn't like that. I mean, I was, because I was there all the time. I wasn't just brought in like when he was down and wanted me to tell a few jokes. It wasn't like that. And, but I really had an honest, straightforward relation, like from day one in the talk about the job. I mean, that's what it was like.
There's this mutual respect. And one thing I was kind of curious about, when you're a photojournalist and, you're working there at the White House, and obviously you're there every day. Do you think, is it a bad thing as a photojournalist to get too close to your subject, or is it a good thing, or how do you kind of view that aspect? Because you're there to do a job.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, for the access, of course, sprung out of two things: my personality, what I did, and I was working for Time magazine. So Time was the best publication around, and for news, and had a respect for photography, certainly. But I wasn't, I wasn't getting into the political stuff or anything. But I just, in a way, being a photographer, I guess, is different. I don't see where a reporter would have that kind of a relationship, because in a way that would be more compromising. And I'm not trying to justify this in any particular way. Yeah. But it didn't, I think the important thing, it didn't get in the way of my journalistic integrity, how I looked at it. Now, when I became the White House photographer, I was no longer in the press corps. I was a White House employee. I mean, if you look what Pete Souza has done, I mean, Pete really became more political about it. I mean, he'll admit that. He is...
well, not till after, though. I don't think, like, he didn't
no, exactly. No,
yeah,
exactly. Afterwards, but he kind of took it as a personal crusade to troll Trump. Really, he's done a hell of a good job at it, which I appreciate.
He's really made a career out of it.
Yeah, big time. Yeah. So, but he had been a Chicago Tribune. But before that, he had been a White House photographer for Ronald Reagan. Period. Worked with Mike Evans, and didn't become the chief photographer, but and then back to the Tribune, and he was covering Obama, and he got to know Obama. So those roads are always very similar. Usually, going into like working for a president, they have to be aware of you somehow, and whether. Eric Draper had a good relationship with Bush, having covered him as an AP photographer, but he applied for the job. I mean, Eric will tell you the story, and my relationship was different. All the relationships are different, and Ollie's was arm's length, but that's how it was with Nixon and everybody. Okamoto is my hero of the White House photography group, and was the best one ever.
Yeah, I watched a presentation you gave somewhere on YouTube, and I never had seen this photo before, and you showed a photo of Yoshi that was incredible. It was a photo of President Johnson in the hospital. He's was having some type of surgery, and
a gallbladder out.
The president has the oxygen mask on his face, and then it's just Yoshi's there just snapping pictures, and I was like, wow. And I think even
it's unbelievable. Well, actually, I came across those. Oki is what we call them. Oki.
Yeah.
Oki had the most incredible access, and in a way, that was out of Johnson's vanity and about history, certainly, and all that. Okamoto really took advantage of it. He did a brilliant job. Plus, Johnson was a great subject, and but when I was going through contact sheets and I saw this picture of Okamoto wearing like surgical stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so I turned over the contact sheet, the next page, and there's Johnson with an oxygen mask and like laying in bed, and Hubert Humphreys over him, and LBJ. I mean, Hubert Humphrey is in there, and then I went, holy mackerel! I mean, I don't know that I would have taken those pictures of Ford, but okay.
Well, I'll pull a picture right now that you took of Betty Ford when she was in the hospital, which was pretty powerful. I think she was battling cancer.
Yeah, that was at the Bethesda Naval Hospital. She had just had a mastectomy, and President Ford, his back's to us on the right, and Bob Hope. He brought Bob Hope and Bob Hope's buddy over, and you
Yep.
can see Mrs. Ford's laughing.
Hmm.
And no, I had a lot of pictures over there, but I didn't go to the operating room.
Yeah,
But
but
it
still,
was
just
like, I mean, Jesus,
and
there's got to be a limit here.
and I think back then for Betty Ford, I guess for reading this back then, like women, they wouldn't publicly talk about having breast cancer and things like that. So
No.
for Betty Ford to kind of do this was pretty powerful thing back then.
Well, Betty Ford really was one of the most, one of the bravest people I ever knew. And she was talking about that. I mean, you brought up a really good point. It was 1974. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, and they were going to do the test and decide, and then very shortly thereafter, it was all in the same visit.
Yeah.
Decided to do this mastectomy, which is removing a breast. And so afterwards, she staff people say, look, you don't need to go out and talk about this. And, you have your privacy. And she said, no, women need to know about this. And so that was very brave on her part, but also President Ford stood with her in doing that. And there are so many women that have credited Betty Ford with saving their life because of that. And we all think about her like the Betty Ford Center.
Yep.
Excuse me. The Betty Ford Center for Drug and Alcohol Rehabilitation, all that. And believe me, I've had 4 of my friends go through that, and she helped in the interventions, and she was very hands-on with it. And she's more remembered for that. But
Yeah.
she also was, the first big, bold move was breast cancer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it was a powerful picture.
And supporting the Equal Rights Amendment, which, by the way, has never passed.
Yeah. I guess, being that you worked in the White House so closely with the president and being around all these like government officials, world leaders, obviously you shot other administrations as well. Like, what do you think you've learned about like government, like getting the opportunity to be so up and close and personal with, like, when you're with Ford, you're seeing what these big decisions are happening day in and day out. Like, going through that experience, do you feel like you learn anything just about government in general and how it operates or anything like that?
Well, I mean, I've covered every president since LBJ.
Yep.
So that's like a ton.
Mm-hmm.
And LBJ was really just one. I photographed him on one event, but it counts because I was there. In fact, he was at the dedication of at the National Portrait Gallery of a portrait of Harry Truman. And Harry Truman was the president when I was born, so that kind of counts. Except
all right, we'll add it to the list.
He wasn't. I'm not going to pad my resume with Harry Truman for God's sake. But anyway, I think then, I mean, the one I can really talk about because I was in there day in and day out was the Ford administration, how things work, the integrity of the people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he didn't have one person go to jail or even get indicted or even he had a clean administration. I mean, granted, he was only there 2.5 years, but the first 2.5 years of the Trump administration, it was sort of like, Fort Leavenworth Express, and
Yeah.
But that's not the point. What I learned is that government can function really well. It depends on who's running the departments. I mean, the Attorney General was Ed Levy, who was a law professor from Chicago. I was just talking about him the other day with Don Rumsfeld, and I still remain friends, and he's from Chicago. And Rumsfeld was chief of staff, then became Secretary of Defense, replacing Jim Schlesinger, whom Ford didn't really care for. In fact, this is a perfect example. This is a little off point about Ford's character. He just never said bad stuff. He never demeaned anybody, certainly. I mean, it's not like what you get as a daily diet out of this guy. But he just would, it was, forget racist comments or any of that. I mean, that just wasn't in his head. But Jim Schlesinger really annoyed him because Schlesinger was kind of a condescending person. He was like professorial. I personally liked him, okay, but he would like say stuff to the president like he wasn't getting it, and Ford was like, really extremely sharp, and a guy had been do the budget inside. I mean, just all that. But it really annoyed him. And after one meeting, he looked at me, and no one else was in the room, and he said, I really don't like him very much. And he goes, don't tell anybody I said that.
It's like the most polite, the most polite way to be.
Oh my God. And then he fired him ultimately. And I think with some satisfaction, I'm not totally sure, but he had good staff people, good cabinet officers, everybody, was able to run their own department. He didn't micromanage it. He oversaw it. And one of the few women ever to be in a cabinet up to that point. He had Carla Hills was, I think it was HUD, and the first African American to be in a Republican cabinet, and only the second African American ever. And it was Bill Coleman, sworn in at the White House by Thurgood Marshall, and those two guys were both civil rights icons. Yeah. And I think one of my best pictures of the White House is right before the swearing in. They were together. There it is. I love this shot. And Thurgood Marshall is, you look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a giant, and Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American U.S. Supreme Court justice, was really an incredible human being. And Bill Coleman was present in some of the big civil rights moments, and as an attorney.
And this photo, was this when you were working for Ford, or this was for when you're at UPI when you photographed this?
Oh, this is a presidential photo.
Yeah, Ford. Ford.
And it's on the caption here, but he worked with Marshall, and Coleman worked on the Brown v. Board of Education case, which was landmark, certainly. And but this is huge, and you can see, like, Bill, whom I got to know very well, is so proud. This is a huge moment.
Monumental moment.
My eyes. Huh?
Yeah, monumental moment in history.
But those are the kind of thing. It wasn't the actual swearing in. It's like he's like Justice Marshall is putting like adjusting his robe. But so I live for that kind of stuff, and those are, I'm the only one in the room to take them in many cases. And the other significant part of my job really is discretion, and it's not just a matter of having a top secret clearance. It's a matter of, and it's not just me, it's any photographer who's given access. I mean, we are incredibly discreet people. We want to be in the room. And if you tell like reporters about what you heard and all that, and you won't get in anymore. And so President Ford one time said to me that my gravestone should read, "Here lies the worst source in Washington." And he's right. I mean, he's right about it. Even when I did my own first book, Shooter, back in '79, there was no kiss and tell stuff there. I had it. I could have written stuff. There were personal things, and to this day, I won't do it.
Yeah, it's professionalism. You're there to do a job. You're not there.
Yeah. No, it's like I care about it, and all my colleagues, we're all the same. I mean, it's like it's a professional ethic. It's not a BS thing. It's like real.
Yeah. For sure. And, another thing I was really excited to talk to you about, you photographed Ansel Adams for the cover of Time magazine, who I believe you guys became friends. I was kind of curious, like, how you met Ansel, and like this kind of your experience photographing him, I guess, is such an icon of photography.
Yeah, and also one of the world's great people.
Mm-hmm.
And I met him because I hired Ricardo Thomas as my first hire as a photographer in the White House, who was the first African American photographer ever hired as a White House photographer. And by the way, I didn't do it for that reason. I liked his work.
Yeah.
And this is like 1974. I brought him on board out of Detroit. And he's a good photographer, and he'd showed me his stuff, and somebody had recommended him, and I needed another photographer to replace who left. And it's so funny. Somebody just mentioned that to me the other day. So, well, you hired the first African American photographer. I just honestly didn't think about it that way, and which is what I would like to think is what we'd all think all the time. I mean, it's don't, but. So Ricardo said, you should really you should like get to know Ansel. He was a big fan of Ansel's. I wasn't that aware of Ansel. I mean, that was really out of my lane.
Mm-hmm.
And until I started looking at his pictures, obviously I go, oh my God, and I must have known who he was, but it's not like today. I mean, he's more well known now than he was back then.
Oh,
and so Ricardo introduced me to him and said, you should get Ansel to come back to the White House. And it was up to Ricardo's the one who made it happen, or at least got me to thinking about it. So I thought Ansel should meet the President of the United States and talk to him. And he was, Ansel was not only a great photographer, but a great environmentalist, and particularly like evangelical about the national park system.
I could be wrong. I read his biography back in college years ago, but I think he was one of the founders, or with
Sierra Club.
Yeah, he was one of the founders, right? Like,
yeah,
which is incredible.
Well, Ansel, remember, was born in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
So I mean, he was old when I met him, but he was. I'm trying to think. Let me just run the numbers on this. I think he was born in 08, right?
He died in 84. The year I was born in 84, and that's the year he died.
Right. 84 and 84. Right. So I met him when I like my age now.
Yeah. So
he's actually he was a year older than me.
Yeah.
You can see that he had this kind of energy too. By the way, I mean he was not like moping around and looking or feeling old, and he had a heart thing. And but anyway, I set up a meeting with him and the President of the United States in the Oval Office, and I did a whole because my archive is now at the Center for Creative Photography at University of Arizona.
Yeah.
And but the Center for Creative Photography was founded by Ansel Adams and John Schaefer, who was the president then, in 1975. And so every year now they have the Ansel Adams birthday lecture. I gave it 2 years ago. But my whole lecture was about the relationship with President Ford and Ansel Adams. I mean, I didn't even talk about Ansel's photography. I mean, everybody talks about it all the time and they know it. But I'll just tell you about the first meeting. So it was Bill Turnage and me and the president and Ansel. And Ansel's sitting in the guest of honor chair, and the president is next to him. And no, actually, the president insisted Ansel sit in his chair.
Oh, wow.
And because there were these two chairs. You see the pictures all the time,
Yeah.
And so Ansel is essentially starting to lecture President Ford about the park system, and blah, 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 this is really important. He goes, whoa, Ansel, the president, he says, stop. He said, I want you to know, he said, one of the greatest experiences of my life was being a park ranger at Yellowstone right out of college. So it would have been like 35, 36, somewhere in there.
Mm.
And I loved the parks. He said, you don't have to convince me. And so Ansel says, well, we got through that. Okay. But they had this terrific conversation. And Ansel was talking, one of the things again, he was like this pathological love of the parks and all that. And he and Ford established, and I was like the go-between with. He would send letters to Ford, very critical letters sometimes about cabinet officers and blah blah blah. I mean, he was really interesting stuff. And those letters are all in the archive, but I would hand them off to the president. I mean, they never went through the system, and so. But President Ford. And I can't give you the exact numbers on what happened, but he, because of Ansel, proposed what would have been the biggest infusion of money and adding land to the National Park Service since Teddy Roosevelt. And he proposed the legislation in 1976 during the election year. And because of that, the Democrats shot it down. They thought it would make this Republican look like some kind of a savior of the park system, which it would have been. The numbers are all there. If you go back and look at that legislation, and Ford was truly pissed off about that. That was one of the times I've never seen him so mad. He said, "How can they not do this?" Yeah. I said, "This is for everybody. These are our land. This is not Republican Democrat land." I mean, essentially saying the same thing. I mean, if you look at the record of Nixon, I mean, Nixon started the EPA and the Clean Water Act. I mean, they were not going around torching up the planet like what we're seeing now, where people are not addressing these problems. And like, oh, I got an idea. Let's just give like a huge mining concession to the industry in Alaska. Oh, that's a good way to kind of straighten everything out.
It was up to Trump. If it was up to Trump, he'd open a shopping mall in the Grand Canyon. You know what I mean? Like,
but I'm like an Oregonian. I was brought up loving the land, and it was just tragic lately watching a lot of it burn. You know, near where I grew up, just south of there, actually. But at any rate, Ansel and he had a wonderful relationship. They got together later. Susan Ford went to the Ansel Adams workshop as Ansel's guest with her Secret Service guys and all that. And Ford later, of course, he lost the election to Jimmy Carter. But one of the things that unfinished business for, oh, by the way, the day before Ford left office, he resubmitted the legislation.
Oh, wow.
Sort of an FU thing.
Yeah.
And they still didn't do it. But he wrote a letter. He and Mrs. Ford co-wrote a letter after he was out of office to Carter recommending Ansel for the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And Carter's gave it to him.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Carter didn't have a White House photographer, I don't think.
Well, to put it in the words of Jody Powell, when he was asked that question, he said, "We don't want another David Kennerly in the White House." I can't blame him for that. They definitely weren't going to get me. No, that was for sure.
Yeah. A couple more questions. I'll let you go. You know, one thing I was kind of curious about, like, how do you kind of view photojournalism these days with it's a weird times, like we were talking earlier with like the current president, everything's a conspiracy. It's all fake news.
Yeah.
This term fake news, I never heard it until like a few years ago.
That's fairly modern, I think.
Yeah. It's like, you see it everywhere now. I guess, like, how do you kind of view journalism and social media and everything going forward? I guess, is it like,
by the way, highly recommend this movie called Social Dilemma. I watched it last night. Did you see it?
Yeah, it's interesting and depressing all at the same time.
Yeah, totally depressing, and it makes you just delete all of your social media accounts without even putting out a fond farewell. Well, I mean, the world is so different. I mean, I've adapted to it. Obviously, I have a Instagram account. I mean, I like Instagram the best. I think if I only had one left, just because it's more photo oriented. But Facebook to me is like a little newspaper operation. It's like a small newspaper, and I have a public page, but my private page, which is capped at like 5,000 people, which sounds like a lot, but it's really not in this world. but I know almost everybody on it. I mean, I've pared away people like rude people who would say crappy things, which people are prone to do. I just won't put up with it. I don't allow people to post pictures on my site because I don't want people who used to do it and say, "Hey, what do you think about this shot?" Well, it sucks. Anything else? You know, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but not totally. But I just like controlling my own turf. In that case, it's not a big deal, but it's a good form of expression for me. I take pictures so people see them. I mean, this is not a secret thing. I made a decision a long time ago. People said, well, if you put your pictures on Facebook, the people run with them. And, you know, legitimate people don't. And so, like a big company, they're real fastidious about running somebody's photo.
Yeah.
So you have to just decide, or am I going to not worry about that, or am I going to do it? I mean, so I just kind of made the decision that I have more fun with it, just putting stuff out there.
Yeah.
It's under my terms, and yeah, people steal stuff all the time, but you know, I don't care unless it's somebody I can collect from, and then I go after them.
Yeah. No, it's just
You
interesting.
should.
I think
And I copyright everything I shoot.
Yeah.
And that just gives you, and any photographer listening to this, I recommend that. You can do it online, costs some money, but it really pays off in terms of recovering damages in a much bigger way if somebody violates your copyright.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the longer you do this, your archive becomes like a source of income. So it's like you might as well do the legwork and protect yourself.
Well, I mean, in my archive, which the CCP acquired, like it's like over 1 million objects, you know, with negatives, transparencies, prints, all like a world of credentials from all the stuff. It's really interesting stuff, old cameras, on and on. But the main thing is that I held on to the copyright to my most of everything, not the Ford White House, early days, not so much from like UPI but I never, the last real job I had was the White House photographer. And after that, I generally own everything I've shot unless I made a buyout agreement with somebody.
Yeah.
And that really gave it great value because the kind of stuff I was shooting was very valuable in terms of all that.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess to wrap up, like you've been doing this a long time, David, like what do you think is kind of the key to your longevity in this business, and what kind of keeps you excited, I guess?
I have a curious mind, and I'm, you know, in many ways, but I've always wondered what was going on around the corner. And that drives a lot of it. Caring about photographing important events, or just taking pictures around the block. You know, it's the kind of thing that certainly I never get tired of. As I said earlier, I've never lost my enthusiasm for photography, and not being a gadget guy, I don't wait for the new stuff to come out, but if something comes out that's superior, I get it. Yeah. That's why I like the Canon gear. They pay me to say that, but they couldn't pay me enough to say that if I didn't believe it.
Hey, Canon, reach out if you want me to say that too.
That's right. I'm a Canon Explorer of Light, which is I always say that it felt like a Star Wars kind of logo that they don't have.
It's good, man.
It's like they've been good. I've been working with them since '95, really. And wow. But really, I use the camera gear that allows me to get what I want with the least fuss.
Yeah.
You know, therefore, you've never seen me carrying a lot of cameras around because they get in the way. I mean, you can overburden yourself that way.
Mm-hmm. And I guess what's next for you? And obviously, it's kind of a weird time being a photographer with COVID and everything going on, but anything you're kind of hoping to work on in the future, I guess? Anything kind of on the docket? Or
what was that old song from the Bee Gees? Still Alive.
Yeah.
I'm working on that.
Yeah,
I've been on an airplane since February. This is the longest I've gone without being on an airplane in at least 50 plus years. And,
Yeah.
I'm not stupid about that. I survived like 6 or 7 wars, whatever it's been. And just, I always thought it'd be one of those ironic endings for me, like, oh yeah, he looked the wrong way in London when he crossed the street. Boom! It was a big red bus,
Yeah.
But no, I just it's my attitude. I have a good attitude.
Yeah. Well, David, we could have talked for another 10 hours because we didn't even get to half the stuff you shot, but it was a real pleasure talking to you, man. Like, big fan, everything you've done. So I can't thank you enough for taking the time, man.
Thank you very much. It was fun.
So there you have it. That was the David Hume Kennerly interview. Just want to thank David so much for taking the time to come on the podcast. Just a truly incredible photographer who's just been at it for a long time and is continually shooting and has documented some of the most important moments in U.S. history and world history, and just incredible work. So can't thank him enough. Definitely go check out David's website at kennerly.com, as well as his Instagram at David Hume Kennerly. I'll put the links in the description, but definitely go check out more of his work. Just incredible stuff. And as always, I'll be having weekly podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as the Photo Banter YouTube page. So feel free to go check that out. Like, subscribe, and all that. The support is much appreciated. And as always, thanks so much for listening, and take care.